So I'm going to talk about a little bit about my work history and why that's relevant to the global issues we're currently facing, and then I'll give some updates on World War III. So I was an intelligence analyst in the Army. When I joined, it was in 2004. So I was a weird kid. I was a person that I actually got a CD. Back then they had a CD with 250 jobs, and I actually researched the job that I wanted. I was an intelligence analyst, and basically my job was to convince the commander of what decisions to make. I would war game as the enemy and give the commander different options on what to do. So as I went further into my career, and you work at staff and you do different things. You process clearances. If you deploy, then you're the person who's planning missions. There's all different kinds of 35 Fox, 96 Bravo is what they were before. 35 Fox. It's a very adaptable MOS. You can go to a lot of different places. You can do a lot of different things. When I went to Germany, I was in an MI unit, so a military intelligence unit that focused on the European theater. So I was in charge of the Balkans and mostly Kosovo and Bosnia were my areas of interest. So that was my primary function at the time during for the 3 years that I was stationed in Germany. The unit also switched and kind of divided, and the focus went from being solely in Europe, European theater. AFRICOM split off from what was EUCOM. So EUCOM split, and then AFRICOM, and some of the folks that I knew, the guys of my unit, they went over there. And so that was the beginning of that introduction. When I deployed, obviously, we were, when I went to Iraq, we were actually close to the Iranian border. I was in a little town called Tuz, which is actually where Saddam Hussein, that's his actual birth town. And so initially I was up at FOB Warrior in Kirkuk, and then, which is in the northern Iraq, and then where the Kurds are. Then we moved to FOB, just outside of where Spiker is, Cop Spiker, which is in Tikrit, and we were in the Saladin province, all the way down at the bottom, towards the Iranian border in a little place called Tuz. And FOB Bernstein, I was trying to think of the name. So after I left active duty in 2012, I transferred into the reserves. And interestingly enough, I got a job at the Defense Intelligence Agency working for the Cyber, can't remember the name of it, the Cyber Threat Analysis Center. So this was sort of the beginning of taking cyber threats and applying them to the intelligence picture, because that was sort of a different thing. So now, how are we incorporating cyber and later on information operations, which used to be like PSYOPs essentially, incorporating those aspects into the intelligence cycle. And so working in that office, I realized, I started to see the writing on the wall, and I realized that the industry was going to a more cyber focus. So I knew that I needed those skills. So I started taking classes. I started, doing the education that I needed, taking even credentials, online courses, anything I could to learn everything in the cyber realm. And then I started pursuing certificates in that aspect. At the same time, in the reserves, here's what's interesting. I would go to work at the Defense Intelligence Agency in Washington, D.C. on Joint Base Bowling. And Monday through Friday, I would go to work, and I would work on the first floor in the Cyber Threat Analysis Center. Then, 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year, I would support the defense industries, I can't remember, it was DRI. And that was on the 5th floor, and we had a totally different mission. And it was a completely different thing, and then it was very interesting that I had to hook up. To find my unit, here's the funny thing. I get to work, right? And when I get there, I give my paperwork. I drove to where the paperwork said my unit was supposed to be. The building was empty. There was nobody there. It was gutted out. I was like, what is this? So I'm getting scared that I'm going to be found AWOL, and then I'm going to get arrested. And I'm talking to my supervisor at work. He looks at my paperwork, and he goes, that's my unit. And I was like, what? So it turns out that my supervisor at work, right, was in my unit At the time, I was in E6. I was a staff sergeant. He was in E5. He was a sergeant. So I ended up becoming his supervisor in the reserves, but he was my supervisor at work. I think we're the same age, so it's interesting. Then eventually I ended up, I bounced around in DC as a contractor a bit. I ended up working, I helped stand up the MCIOC, the Marine Corps Information Operations Center in Quantico. So that was the first Information Operations Center for the Marine Corps. I helped stand that up. And then I went over to 1st IO Command in Springfield, and I helped create some cyber training and basically help develop all of the policy for cyber warfare that exists today. I had input on developing the policy from that level at the command level. I then began working over in the Underground Facilities Analysis Center, also for DIA. So just to get it out of the way, I had a top secret clearance. I was what's called sensitive compartmented information, so SCI access. Most people don't understand the intelligence, the classification process, so I'll explain classifications. All right, so there's unclassified, which means anybody could see it. There's for official use only, which isn't really a classification, but it's still unclassified, but people shouldn't see that. There's confidential, nobody uses it, but this is just, it's kind of serious, but not that serious. Secret, which is, that is what the primary intelligence being collected, and also like when it comes to operations, you're gonna probably see most of the stuff being secret. And then there's then there's caveats, which is like who can see things. No one can see it. These people can see it. Whatever category it falls under. If there's a special access program, which we'll get to separately, those will have their own labels and their own codes. So I'm not gonna get into the particulars of it, but. Then there is top secret information. Well, the difference between them is like each level basically causes a greater amount. If the information were to get out, it would cause a greater amount of damage. So top secret meaning that's the greatest amount of damage. Now within top secret, there are special, you actually have what you need, two things. You have, if you have the clearance, you need the clearance access, but you also need to know. So laterally, even though you have a top secret clearance, there's things you just don't need to know because you don't work in that office. So those you'll have to have like special access programs, and you get read into and read off of. So I've been read onto numerous ones. I won't get into the particulars. My resume speaks for itself. It's also on LinkedIn. So you could look up my resume on LinkedIn and see all the information. I don't want to bore anybody with just reading my resume, even though I probably already have a video of that somewhere. So in doing that, so I was doing information operations, all source intelligence analysis, and cyber threat analysis, cybersecurity. So I sort of became what would later be known to several CEOs for companies that did a lot of contracting as a unicorn. They would put my name on a resume and it would get them a contract easily because I came with all these skills and I can do all these different things. So I was kind of a fixer. I was a consultant. I started my own business, and I would just go into these places and fix the programs. If they had lack of personnel, I had different skills, so I could sort of meet these guidelines and sort of help the contract assimilate other things. And we'd have to rewrite statement of work and get amendments. I forgot what we used to call them to the contracts, but basically just, add stuff on. And so we would, that was kind of the benefit that I brought onto the situation with my experience. So again, I worked for the Underground Facilities Analysis Center, like I said. What do you think that the Underground Facilities Analysis Center does? I don't have to explain it. Listen, in order for something to be classified, you'd need location, name, and some sort of like date, time, something that gives it, the whole aspect to it. So you need several aspects in order for me to reveal that. So just so everybody understands, nobody's hearing any classified information on here. I'm simply talking, this is all open source information discussing the classification levels, the information. And now, that being said, I was a Middle East analyst. I worked for, I also worked at the Pentagon. While I was at the Underground Facilities Analysis Center, UFAC, I went to support a mission at the J-23. Now, whatever, people don't understand what those things are. So J stands for joint, meaning that instead of it being just the Army or the Navy, it can be either two or more, and that the two is typically the intelligence function, And so the 2-3 is just meaning there's a larger organization. So this is probably like the operations aspect of the intelligence, whatever. So I was the Middle East regional analyst, and I would brief the Undersecretary of Defense and the Secretary of Defense and Joint Chiefs of Staff. So my work directly contributed to the President's Read Book that would go onto the desks of Barack Obama and Donald Trump himself. And I was told while I was working there that Donald Trump didn't actually read the Read Book, and even offered to read it to him myself. I said, look, if he wants it in an entertaining way, I'll make it entertaining. Here we are. So that being said, let me kind of explain what my expertise in there. If I was a Middle East analyst and we worked on underground facilities, all right, so I'll just say Moab, mother of all bombs, that's a pretty cool thing. Anyway, the understanding where my expertise comes without me saying too much, the intelligence that we had back then suggested that Iran was not in possession of a nuclear weapon then. How close they were, I couldn't estimate because we received intel from different places, but based on our estimates, they weren't anywhere close. So, that being said, let's think about something. Right now, the President of the United States is bringing in this doomsday plane that's meant for nuclear holocausts, and he is not communicating with the Secretary of Defense. He is not communicating with the Director of National Intelligence, who already testified earlier this month that Iran does in fact not have a nuclear weapon and is not close. What sense does it make that this is our position? In order to prevent this country that is potentially dangerous and is trying to get a nuclear weapon, which they don't have, their neighbor, which has lots of nuclear weapons, Israel, decides to preemptively bomb them. Now that we have to support Israel to stop this, because the U.S. is already engaged, which is illegal. The president is not consulting Congress with this. Is again going past Congress, showing how inept they all are. That we are now engaging in direct conflict with Iran, a non-nuclear power. They're so dangerous that they may use a nuke, that the president is considered using a tactical nuclear weapon to destroy the facility that would potentially create a nuclear weapon for them. Let me say that again. So our plan, in order to prevent these guys from apparently defending themselves with a nuclear weapon, we have to preemptively use one. So in order to prevent them from using a nuclear weapon, we have to use one on them. I think that it's past time for speaking about impeachment. He's already been impeached twice. Like these are office politics. I think that something a little bit more drastic is necessary. And when I say that, I specifically mean the 25th Amendment. We are sitting here, Congress is still pretending that Trump has all his faculties. No. We should be enacting the 25th Amendment because the 25th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution deals with presidential succession. Let me say that word again. Deals with presidential succession. Presidential succession and disability, and it provides a mechanism for removing a president from office due to inability to discharge the powers and duties of the office. It's right there. This is an emergency situation. Now, that being said, on day one of his presidency, Donald Trump was signed an order looking to find out how he can suspend habeas corpus for these ICE raids. Now Donald Trump is using ICE against police and against other law enforcement agencies and basically using them as a private army to detain citizens with no warrants, just abducting people, right? And the law, the rules were, or the memos for engaging in activities such as responding to the riots. These were peaceful protests that had some people getting, there were some things got out of hand in some places. It was nothing compared to anything in the past with that LAPD has not handled before. It was nowhere near the George Floyd riots. It was nowhere near any anything of the past. It was a little bit of civil disobedience. And the response was met with that in order to counter the Epstein files bombshell that dropped, and also counter all the bad news that Trump's been receiving, all the bad press. And so as such, lashing out in this way. And so what we end up with is a president who's seeking to institute martial law. If the president institutes martial law for any reason, if he finds a way to use this conflict as a way to suspend habeas corpus, to suspend, the Constitution, and to enact martial law, it's very likely that he'll just cancel, postpone, or otherwise prevent the midterm elections from happening. And thus the same thing with 2028. And then he doesn't have to run for a third term because there's no elections. We are in dire situations. These are all very possible things. All of these things. I want to also say, for anybody who's justifying the action against Iran or what's happening in defense of Israel as something that is of a religious nature, let me just say this. Even if you are a Christian, I am. I was raised a Roman Catholic, and my wife was raised a Jehovah's Witness. So yes, if you're asking, my kids are confused. But these decisions should be they shouldn't be based on your political choices, shouldn't be based on religious aspects, because that's a slippery slope. Because if you're saying that, let's say you're just using Jesus, what version? There's so many different aspects. So our forefathers had enough foresight to see that this would be a problem. So understand that the government of Israel, right, is not the same as Israel as mentioned in biblical texts. This is a country that was created in the 1950s, a government entity, right, on land that was called Palestine. Okay? I understand that there's nuance to this, and I understand all the... I don't have time for all that. We as Americans, we don't have time for that. That's, to be honest, none of our business. We should not be... Israel is the aggressor in this situation. Israel is not defending itself by indiscriminately bombing 5 of its neighbors. Even if Iran was close to a nuclear weapon, Israel did not need to strike it first. Iran had nothing to do with Hamas. You could argue that there are all sorts of funding sites, and it's irrelevant at this point. We are talking about a potential nuclear holocaust. Why are we having this discussion? We shouldn't be having it at all. We need to de-escalate this situation. We are talking about potential nuclear war. Now, when I say that, they're saying, why? How? They don't have any nuclear weapons. The country of Pakistan has stated that if we use a nuclear weapon on Iran, they will retaliate with a nuclear weapon. And thus, the president gets his little doomsday plane and shows up in Washington, D.C. so that he can be nice in the sky and safe. Man in the high castle. Look, I understand these reasons, and I understand there's nuance, but let's be here. Let's understand that these people have been violating the first commandment, which is not using the Lord's name in vain. They are using God's name for greed, to kill, to justify death, to justify business interests. True practitioners of their faith would choose to wait for God to bring about the end at his own time, not rush to play God and decide that they are the Messiah. That's blasphemy. Donald Trump is also erasing any mention of diversity, anything non-white from government websites. He wanted to cancel Juneteenth. And let's make it clear. It's hard for black folks to celebrate the 4th of July when that was the day that their masters merely rebranded from English to American. Though the U.S. fought for independence on July 4th, all people of the United States of America were not free until June 19th, 1865. Freedom Day, otherwise called Juneteenth. This day commemorates the effective end of slavery in the United States, though most people attribute the end of slavery to Abraham Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation. In truth, slaves were not free, and in fact, for the next 2 years, all sorts of rules would be set in place, essentially rendering slavery as incarceration, and thus began America's over-policing problem. Instead, this is meant to specifically celebrate the day when Union soldiers arrived in Galveston, Texas, to announce that the more than 250,000 enslaved African Americans in the state were free, as per the Emancipation Proclamation. This announcement came over 2 years after the proclamation was initially issued. Think about that. It's time that we start recognizing the sins of the past. Like, we need to make up for it. I know too many older folks that just don't want to admit their mistakes. I have a problem just simply saying, I'm sorry, or apologizing. When you admit you're wrong, it's good for your soul too. We need to move on. We need diplomacy, not war. This is a serious issue. We're either going to wipe ourselves out with a nuclear holocaust or an AI holocaust. We are on the brink. We are getting it from all sides. We need to stick together. I don't know what else to say. I believe we'll make it through, but it's going to be a tough fight. We'll do it together. Let's go.